Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
So we have an interesting topic to talk about, but I never studied this. I never studied macroeconomics before, so I'm not sure how much I can contribute to this.
Well, all right. I am an English major, so let me extol at length about macroeconomics. I think basically it's just big economics. So there you go.
That's the thing. Macro is big and micro is small, right?
Yeah. But you didn't think that you were tuning into a financial podcast, right?
No, and not a podcast even that's going to give you investment advice.
Oh, God,
No. Pay no attention to our investment advice. Past performance is no indication of future whatever.
Let me tell you a story about Home Grocer, which was a stock that I bought back when E-Trade was a thing. And I was like, all right, well, I could do this. And listener, I lost money. Fortunately, I didn't put in a lot of money. I was just dabbling. But that was when I realized, hey, you know what? This is not for me.
Okay, so the macro we're going to talk about, obviously, is macro
photography.
Macro photography, right. And what's interesting is macro means big. And when you do macro photography, you take photos of something very small.
Yep.
I mean, you're beginning the small thing, but you would think it would be micro photography instead of macro photography.
Yeah, you'd think. This must be just another one of those things where photographic terminology just evolves weirdly. I guess somebody thought, well, this tiny thing that I'm looking at, I'm making it very big, so it's a macro. So let's just do that. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. But it's a very cool effect.
It's a very, effect, no. It's a very cool genre of photography.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way, as we were saying before you started recording, it's an interesting way to find things to take pictures of without going far. You can go into your garden and find flowers and leaves and bugs. And we started by me showing some bad photos I took of raindrops on a rose bush the other day. And they were bad because they weren't all in focus. And that's, it was one of those things. But you can see these things and realize, wow, if I go in really close on it, I'm going to see something that I wouldn't see any other way. You're magnifying it, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this sounds very cliche, but I'm going to say it anyway. It really opens up another world that we just don't see because we're not looking that closely, or we're moving in too fast in regular life, or, all of these things. But of course, there are all sorts of things going on at a smaller level, whether you're talking about insects, like right now, especially in the summer, great time to get insects flying on flowers, like bees are pollinating and stuff. But even just getting close up to, flowers and plants and rocks and all these things that
tree bark and lichen and moss and things like that. Depending on how much magnification you have in your macro lens, you can get it's a whole new world. You can see things that you wouldn't see otherwise. And it's gotten really accessible with the iPhone and other phones having a macro mode, which isn't really a macro lens, but it's kind of cheating, right? When it does a macro photo with the iPhone.
That's a very good point. I would say it's not really cheating because it is giving you that macro zoom. And at least in the case of like the iPhone, what's notable about it is that you can get very, very close to something. Now, there are a couple of ways you could do macro photography. Like if you have a traditional camera, maybe you have a nice big long zoom and you can zoom in on something very small. But because of the way the optics work, sometimes you find yourself standing farther away in order to zoom way in because that focusing distance of your telephoto lens is not going to be super close. But if you have like a regular macro lens, oftentimes the optics are such that you can get very close. And that's the case with the iPhone. The iPhone, that it uses the wide angle lens, but you can get, I want to say it's like 5 millimeters or something and still have focus in the middle. And that really just lets you literally get super close to something, not just optically.
You don't necessarily need a lens that embiggens what you're shooting.
Right.
But what you need is that focal plane distance to be very close. Even if the lens isn't, what's the correct word for embiggening something? Not zooming, enlarging. Because there are some macro lenses actually enlarge what you're seeing, right, through optics. But the most important thing is to get close enough to be able to see something that's very small.
Yeah.
Why does it sound complicated to explain when it's basically you got to get close? Now, the thing about macro photography is it's not that simple. You got to be very careful with the aperture that you're using, because the closer you get, the less depth of field you get on your aperture. So you want to have your aperture stopped down as much as possible to get as much depth of field as you can, and yet you might not have enough light for that. If you look at some really fancy macro photos, and there's one on Wikipedia which is really scary. It's like a close-up of a common yellow dung fly, and it looks like something from one of these science fiction movies. And this is often done with focus stacking, where your camera's on a rail, you take one photo, you move it, I don't know, a centimeter, you take another photo and you move it a centimeter without changing the focus on the camera. So each shot that you're doing is moving the focal plane, and then you use software to put them together.
Yeah.
That's one way to get a macro photo of something in great detail without having to worry about f-stop and light. Now, if you could stop down to f16 and had enough light, you could probably get the same depth of field, right?
I think so, but when you're talking about macro, even stopped way down, that can be more difficult, just because you are focusing on such a narrow focus. What's interesting about that is you can also do this without having some sort of rail. Actually, a lot of phones will have a focus bracketing mode, and so it will adjust the focus just a little bit. Now, depending on the lens, that could also introduce distortion. So, because as you focus in, things around the edges won't necessarily stay in the same spot. So when you're focus stacking there, that's like an added challenge. But when you're talking about like really, really extreme close-ups like that bug, or sometimes people use like maybe some food photography, doing focus stacking really helps, because you do want as much of that in focus, and the optics just won't do that. So that's definitely a good way to do it. But you also mentioned light, which is a really good point, because oftentimes a lot of people who do macro photography in a serious way, they will have basically like a little lighted hood that comes out over the lens, because it's kind of like a ring light, but it diffuses the light a little bit more.
But it's ringing vertically rather than ringing straight toward the object. It's ringing above it.
Some of it, yeah. Like I think it's kind of blanketing the area.
It's providing a field of light instead of just directing a ring of light.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it gets the light from many different angles. You don't want too many shadows in macro photography, because things are really small, the shadows stand out.
Exactly. So you'll have, like, I've seen amazing photos of like mushrooms. Like you go and look at the underside of a tiny mushroom, and it can just be incredibly detailed. And something like that, you would need extra light, even if it's just maybe, light that you're bouncing with a tiny reflector. But I guess the point here is this can get very complicated very quickly, and it can be super rewarding if you want to pursue that. But you also don't need all that stuff to make good macro photography, because you also have that in your phone.
Okay, let's skip the phone and let's go to real cameras, because saying you also have that in your phone makes it sound like it's too easy, and it's not really that easy.
That's true.
Because you need a little bit more work than that. One thing, most cameras aren't really designed for macro photography. You can get close to something depending on what your lens is. I'm talking about real cameras, not telephone things. You can get close and you can crop and all of that. And depending on your resolution, you might get a picture that looks macro, but it's technically not macro. A macro photo is a photo that is at least the actual size of the item you're photographing. In other words, on the sensor. It's defined something like that.
Oh, right.
So if you're using like a standard 50 millimeter lens and you're 18 inches away, it's not a macro photo, even if you zoom in and crop. But you can buy a special macro lens for pretty much every camera, and they're designed for that close focus plane. Some cameras or some lenses actually have a clutch to switch from normal mode to macro mode. My Leica Q3 does that. I was looking up the M Zuiko Digital ED 90mm f3.5 macro has a similar clutch on the side. You switch from macro mode to normal mode to be able to focus closer. And there are a few lenses like that. It's not unheard of. It's kind of interesting that the Leica Q series has been doing this, I think, since the first Q, because I guess it's that kind of camera that dentists buy, and dentists have gardens, and gardens have flowers, and I don't know what the logic is. Or maybe it's just something that works with the 28mm lens that's in this camera that they could do easily enough.
Yeah. Or it helps justify the enormous cost of the camera, or it's something that is built in, and because you don't have the Q doesn't have interchangeable lenses, right? It's just
No, it's a fixed lens camera.
Yeah, fixed lens camera. So it's not like you can add a macro lens to it. So because it's also highly portable and you can take it anywhere, this gives you more options to shoot with.
So what to shoot? Gardens are a great place. And even if you don't have a garden behind your house, you may have a botanical garden someplace where you will see the most extraordinary plants. Botanical gardens are great if you get there early in the morning or late in the evening because the sun is coming from the side and you'll get the shadows through leaves of trees if it's got trees and flowers and all that. You might find one with orchids or roses, and they're going to be in all different stages of bloom. Maybe, I mean, if you're listening and you don't really care to look at flowers, that's fine. But the more I look at them, the more I appreciate the art that's in nature, the symmetry that's in nature that you can discover. And if you get the right angle, some flowers you want to be in front, some you want to be above. And if you get really, really close, sometimes it's abstract. Georgia O'Keeffe's flower paintings, one of my favorite art books, it's a very large format book with these flower paintings. She did these close-up flower paintings. She did macro painting with her eyes, right? So she looked at them and then painted them much larger than reality. And you see things in there that you don't see elsewhere. I don't know how to describe it. There's an interesting feeling if you're curious that you look into something like that.
Yeah. Well, also, and this is a question that's come up before in the podcast, when you're trying to think of what should I go out and shoot, this is a great example of being able to look anywhere and see texture. So light and texture really can look different in a macro environment because you're not necessarily thinking, oh, well, that's a flower or that's a fence or that's a tree, that's a person. You can really be looking at it as the light is coming across in this zigzaggy way and the pattern on this leaf, makes like a little spiral. And there are just so many different creative things that you can look for that, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned right before we started recording was that feeling of going outside and seeing something, and it like triggers that thing in your brain that says, oh, the light's doing something cool here. And you grab your camera and you take some shots. And sometimes the shots don't work out, and that's fine. But, your brain is doing that thing, so you're looking at photos, you're looking at the world in that photo way. And I think when you look at the macro world, I guess, like looking through a macro lens, that also gives you it disconnects you from all the things that you normally see, which can be super valuable when you're just trying to figure out what should I take pictures of.
Yeah, so the other day I walked outside, and as I said before, there were raindrops on this rose bush, and they were really interesting. Now, they were right next to the window on the patio, so I couldn't really get in the perfect position to take care of pictures of all of them without bumping into the rose bush and knocking the raindrops off.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are out of focus because I think I was shooting at f3.5 and I should have been up at like f8 to get depth of field. But some of them are really interesting. And even if they're not good photos that I won't keep or that I won't spend time editing, there's something about looking at something that close in a different way that changes what you're used to seeing. Well, one thing about macro photos is you're not often worried about composition. In other words, you don't have a tree here and a rock there and a bush there. It's all, you're really focused on something, right? And your only composition is what you crop eventually. The photographic process is concentrated into a very small area, and it's a different way of looking at photos. And, you could walk around and do anything. I'm just looking at all the stuff on my desk. I have this really interesting piece of marble, which I once found in the mountains in France. It was obviously cut to be about an inch thick, and it broke off. I use it as a paperweight. I found it walking on a trail. And you can see there's a little bit of texture. And this is the kind of thing that you could put water on this, put oil on it, and zoom in and get something of the texture. You could find anything like that. Take a piece of fruit. Take a overripe banana and go really close at the little black spots. There's no end of things that you could take macro photos of that would be interesting. Well, so we talked about plants and we talked about, rocks and things like that. You mentioned food briefly, and food is something that's really interesting when you zoom in on it. Vegetables can be extremely interesting. What do you call that kind of cabbage that has a spiral in it? On the top,
I don't know.
It's a type of broccoli, I think.
Yeah.
And it's got a really interesting spiral. My neighbors, the farmers, they grow these cabbages. And a few years ago, I went out while they were growing and took some macro photos of them. And it's really fascinating to see that symmetry in nature, that mathematical part of nature that, is basically an equation creating that spiral form.
Yeah.
You could take a picture of cars, bits of cars, different bits. I mean, seriously, if you go around with a macro lens and you get your mind into that what's weird type thing, you can find lots of interesting things to photograph.
Yeah. And I think part of the reason why this is appealing is that, I know people who take macro photos. I know we're sort of folks bouncing around between phones and sort of regular cameras, but just in terms of like stuff to shoot, I know people who they don't generally take very many photos. Like our mutual friend Glenn Fleischman, he takes some photos, but I don't think that he would say that he is a photographer. But he loves taking pictures of bees and insects and flowers and things because he has a whole garden outside of his house. And, randomly he will just send me a picture of a bee. And he's not doing this seriously. He's just taking pictures with his phone. But it tickles a part of his brain that needs to, find images of something. And that's the thing that he has found. And I sort of love that because, for the longest time, I never even thought about macro photography because I figured I needed extra equipment. I needed a macro lens. And macro lenses will tend to be a bit more expensive because they have more elements to them. They're more specialized. And it just seemed like it was kind of out of reach. But now with the iPhone, it can take really good macro photos. And I should also point out, as I mentioned the iPhone, there's a thing that I've run into and I've mentioned and written about before. The iPhone does this weird thing where it's using the wide-angle camera because that has the close focusing distance. But if you start taking a macro photo and then you think, what I really should do is turn on the telephoto camera, switch to that, so switch to 3x or 5x, because that'll get me closer. The phone does this weird thing because sometimes the telephoto will not provide enough light. And so what it will do is it will basically make a digital version of what you're focusing on and switch to a different camera. And you'll end up with a really low-res, crappy-looking image.
Yeah.
So if you're going to shoot macro, like just stick with the macro that pops up. There's also a way, and I should find the link. Adam Engst wrote about this in Tidbits, where you can get a higher resolution macro photo because on the iPhone 16, I believe, the wide angle lens has a higher resolution than it used to. Like I think it's 24, maybe even 40 now. I should know this off the top of my head, but of course
you should. You should know all of these details.
But when it switches to the macro mode, it's actually not using the full resolution of the sensor. It's like I think you end up with like a 12 megapixel image, even though the sensor itself can do more. And there's a way to force it to get a higher resolution, but it's not quite the same. Like you're relying on more of your own close focusing rather than letting the macro mode help you out. So that was a very long way of saying there are situations where you might think that you've got a great shot and the phone is kind of getting in your way. But for the most part, it really does a remarkable job of capturing macro stuff. I'll also point out that a colleague that I work with, Andrew Langson at CNET, he recently wrote about a new camera. It's called the Nothing Camera 3, I think. And overall, it's not a great phone, and the cameras on it are really also not that great. But for some reason, it shoots fantastic macro photos. And it doesn't use the wide angle. It's just using its main camera to do this. And I think it's like a 50 megapixel camera that it's using. And he was kind of blown away. And he's also a professional photographer. He has a YouTube channel dedicated to photography. And I think he was genuinely surprised. Just, as you do, he saw a bee on some flowers, pulled out his phone, took a picture of it, and the quality based on the iPhone or compared to the iPhone was a lot better. There was like less focus fringing around the outside, and whatever they've done, this makes a really great macro image.
But you're not going to buy that telephone just for the macro.
No,
camera.
You're not. You're not.
It's a shame that you can have a device that's good at one thing and not good at other things.
Yeah.
That seems like a really limited use case to buy a phone.
Totally. But it also kind of shows that there's a lot of variation in what's out there. Now, yeah, you're not going to buy a phone based entirely on the camera, most likely. But it's one of those things. And, when Apple introduced the macro mode, I want to say like in the iPhone 12 or something like that, it was something that a lot of people never even would have thought about, and yet suddenly here they could do it. And again, like it's opening up some photography to people who never would have thought about it, never would have tried it, and now they're enjoying getting nice close-up pictures. It's really accessible, and I love it for that. And then if you start looking in that realm, then you can step up and think, okay, well, maybe I want higher quality. Maybe I really do want to go out in the woods and take pictures of moss really, really close. And then you can look into getting a camera and a macro lens and go down that dangerous path where your bank account gets smaller, but your lenses get bigger. But there's some satisfaction in that if that works out.
It's a good point, though, that you can try it out with a phone now before you buy a macro lens just to see what it's like, even if you're not going to get the same quality as your real camera when you buy a macro lens. Fujifilm has a 60 millimeter macro lens that I had in the past that was quite good and wasn't overly expensive. But the better macro lens they have is a 90 millimeter. It's like twice as much. And macro lenses can be very expensive because it's a different type of optics, because they probably don't sell anywhere near as much as they do of normal lenses. I love macro photography. I'll go outside and there's a bit of light on something and it looks interesting, and particularly with the Q3, you go with the macro clutch. I don't know how close I can focus, but it's just a couple of inches, which is surprising how close you can get without having a dedicated macro lens. So lots of fun.
Lots of fun. I encourage everybody to try it, and I'm going to make the shameless pitch. Come to our Facebook group and show us your macro photos, because again, I would love to see what other people are doing in this realm.
I'm actually interested how many people actually take macro photos intentionally. In other words, is it part of your photographic language that when you're out taking pictures, you think of looking for things close to you? I think anyone who's a photographer who has a garden has probably done a lot of at least flower photos. And you can get a little bit closer to that flower and it's going to look really different.
Yeah. Or even you mentioned going out earlier in the day. Best time to get dew on grass, and the sun is low, so you get nice cross light. Oh, it's beautiful. I'm sitting here in front of my computer thinking, oh, I really wish I could go do that, but it's too late in the day for us.
Yeah, it depends on the time of year, because we've had a drought here. We had the first rain in a couple of months a few days ago, so there's not enough humidity to get dew. Here, it's spring and fall that you can get that.
Okay.
And you don't get as many flowers, so it's kind of tough to get that balance between the right weather to make the macro photographs look good. But here's a tip. Carry with you a little spray bottle with water.
Yeah.
One of those really fine spray bottles for anything you want to photograph. Spray your, well, not bugs, they probably won't like it, but spray your flowers, spray your leaves, and that changes totally the photo that you take.
Yeah, just give it a little misting. Okay, so what we've covered here, so basically we're saying you start with a phone and you try macro photography, you get a taste of that, and then you buy a regular camera and see how that does, and then you buy a macro lens, and then you erect a greenhouse in the back of your yard so that you can have more control over what gets grown and
right. And so you can grow orchids and you can breed orchids. Orchids are amazing for macro photography. I've never been able to grow orchids last. I've bought some in a pot for a while. They'll last for a few weeks and then they die. They're one of the most interesting subjects for macro photography. And it doesn't always have to be in focus. That whole focus stacking thing isn't always necessary. You might want to have just part of the flower in focus and the rest falling off with a bit of a blur. Because if everything's in focus, it actually doesn't look realistic.
Yeah. And actually, I'll point out one more thing about this. What is nice about macro photography also is that you can have a lot more control over it. So if you're going out shooting street photography or landscape photography, you're really dependent on what's going on, what the weather is like, what the sun is like. With macro photography, generally the things that you're shooting are not moving.
Yeah.
And so unless you have a breeze that's rustling things, I mean, honestly, many times I've held the flower just out of frame to hold it steady, and you can just sit and experiment and make different angles and whatever, or even something on a table in your kitchen. And you don't have that sense of, okay, the light's going to change because of the sun, or I need to wait for the most opportune moment for something to happen on this street with this background. It's no, just have some nice, calm, slow macro photography session and go to town.
Okay, we're each going to contribute a couple of macro photos to the show notes. I'm sure we both have macro photos in our libraries.
Yeah.
And we'd love to see any on the Facebook group. And until next time, take care.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast app.